Hey, hello everybody, and welcome back to the Logos Project. This is your host Dom, and in today's video, I am joined by Dr. Larry Chapp. Dr. Chapp, welcome on the show.
Yeah, it's glad to be back, Dom. It's really great. Thank you.
Anytime. Thanks for coming on. So, quickly for the audience, anyone who's new to the show, I'm going to introduce Dr. Chapp. Dr. Larry Chapp is a retired professor of theology. He taught for 20 years at DeSales University near Allentown, Pennsylvania. In 2013, he and his wife opened the Dorothy Day Catholic Worker Farm in Harveys Lake, Pennsylvania. Dr. Chapp received his doctorate from Fordham University in 1994 with a specialization in the theology of Hans Urs von Balthasar. So today, Dr. Chapp, we're going to talk about Communio Theology and why it's important, and a little bit about the crisis in the church today. And so to kind of open up the question, to open up the conversation, my question for you is, there's a lot of noise right now, especially because we can make noise with the internet. But how is the Catholic Church divided today, and why? What's the landscape here?
Well, that's an enormously complex question because the stage that was set for what is going on now has been sort of developing for the past 100, 200 years. But, obviously the divide, to put it very simply, is between sort of traditionalists, what we call radical traditionalists, borderline SSPX types, and progressive, very liberal Catholics who want to basically bless the modern culture, the LGBTQ movement, climate change agenda, immigration, all that kind of stuff. And then you've got the neocons, the neoconservatives. Their day has kind of faded just a little bit, right? Their heyday was kind of in the Reagan years in the 1980s. Father Richard Newhouse with the journal First Things. And their basic message was that America is a kind of crypto-Catholic country. It just doesn't know it. And so this is the Catholic moment where we can seize the moment. And it was a very pro-American kind of perspective. Their star has faded. And then sort of also on the landscape is this kind of theology that I subscribe to, called Communio Theology, Ressourcement Theology. It is the theology that animated Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict, Joseph Ratzinger. It's the theology that really animated the Second Vatican Council, that won the day, if you want to put it that way. I mean, the council wasn't kind of a contest, but there were sort of winners and losers. And the winners were the Ressourcement Communio guys, and the losers were kind of the neo-scholastic sort of guys. But nobody ever really was able to sort of conquer the church after the council. No one theological school sort of took over after the council. And it's just been kind of a jumbled sort of mess for the past 60 years. And so that's kind of where we are now, with sort of everybody trying to claim their slice of the pie. And where Pope Francis stands in all of this is anybody's guess. I have my guesses, but they may not be as good as anybody else's.
Right. And so when I read the letters, encyclicals, and documents of the Pope, I don't really see a problem, right? The problem isn't really the teaching of the Pope. The problem, to me, it seems, is the politics of this pontificate.
Yes.
So what concerns me isn't the Pope's latest document, right? But the politics raging on right now, and who is wielding the power. And so I have a very short quote here from Michael Hanby, one of his articles recently, and it says, "It is one thing to think politically about theology, and quite another to think theologically about politics, and it's politics all the way down." So the question really is, how is theology being politicized today, and why is that problematic?
It's problematic because the center of the church is Christ, which is ultimately a mystery, a deep and profound theological mystery at the heart of revelation, of which the church is the caretaker. The Second Vatican Council, Lumen Gentium, described the church as the great sacrament in the world of the presence of God, the very presence of the inner Trinitarian life of God made present in the sacraments for our divinization, for our lifting up, for the conquest of sin. That's the heart and soul of the church. which is a reality that can never be completely exhausted. And more importantly, it's a reality that transcends mere political categories. So as soon as you start debating within the church in terms of simple who's in charge of what and power politics, you've already sort of given up the sort of whole thing here, because the gospel cannot be reduced to a set of political ideologies. And one does get the very strong feeling, for example, with progressive Catholics, liberal Catholics, that in many, many ways, their political commitments, their left-wing political commitments, are what drive their theology. It's like the political tail is wagging the ecclesial dog. And so church doctrines get judged not on their merits in terms of whether or not they're consonant with the gospel or with Christ or with the great mystery that is God. No, they're judged on whether or not they coincide with the political agenda of the time. So, if some doctrine of the church is not pleasant for LGBTQ plus IA types, then it has to go. It's got to change. And that's that, without any further ado. And if you oppose that, well, then politically you are called a right winger. Oh, you're just a right winger. You're just an ideologue, a reactionary. No, I'm a Christian. Okay. And hopefully I transcend those categories. We should.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. With the death of Pope Benedict, it's almost like an era came to a close, an era of great theologians, poets, and artists. Now it looks like when you look around, it's a circus with a bunch of clowns running around and the tent is burning to the ground. And, there's some left, like, Schindler, O'Regan, Bishop Barron, there's some left, but they're usually in the academic tower, except for, Bishop Barron, who's very active and very prolific and effective. But there just seems to be no serious thinking, just empty politics. It kind of reminds me of Dr. David Schindler made the distinction between power and authority. And
Yes.
there seems to be this kind of, we've lost the theological sense of authority. Now it's just a kind of political game, kind of like prior to the council. Actually, if you don't mind, I have a quote here it's from
Sure.
Yves Congar. Just a second. It's from his journal, this big volume from the journal to on the council. And this could have come out of one of today's traditionalist authors. It's actually a pretty surprising quote. He says, thus, my intuition about the history of ecclesiological doctrines, of the tension between the Papa pole and the Ecclesia pole, is closer to the truth than I realized. This tension is latent in the council, and it is more than likely that one day it will come out into the open. I think that's today. The Curia understands nothing. The Curia is full of Italians who, being kept in ignorance of the reality of things, is in political subjection, in a simplistic and false ecclesiology, according to which everything is derived from the Pope, see the church only as a vast centralized administration of which they themselves form the center. During these days, I have been compiling notes about the Italians and the church, the ecclesiology of the Italians. Ultramontanism really does exist. Now here he says, victorious theoretically in the official ecclesiology. It exists and is powerfully at work at the level of piety. But his point really is that not that ultramontanism isn't true, but that it's not really about power divorced from authority. And authority, as Schindler says, has to do with something sacramental. So that's just a tangent there. Maybe you could riff off of that. What do you think about this relationship between the sacramental and the political?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great quote from Congar. And I'm not a big fan of the term ultramontanist, mainly because in its original historical construal, it meant something, I think, good.
Yeah.
It meant that Catholics looked to that dude over the mountains.
Yeah.
All right. That dude in Rome as their spiritual and theological guide. And so I prefer to say hyper papalist or papal centralist or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
instead of ultramontanist. But it is true that when one of the great debates at the Second Vatican Council, and of course Congar is formed and framed by that world, one of the great debates was whether or not we're going to conceive of the church in these largely legalistic and juridical categories drawn from neo-scholastic thinking. And those categories then fed into the bureaucratic vision of the church as Catholic Inc., with the Pope as the CEO and the bishops as just branch managers, and the Italians were the sort of bureaucracy that kept it all running. That was the juridical, legalistic vision of the church, and the council sought to downplay the juridical elements of the church in favor of the church, as I said, as a sacrament, as a mystery, but as a communio, a communion of local churches with Peter and under Peter, but still a communion first of local churches, and not simply as the Pope at the top dispensing spiritual gifts willy-nilly, like a Santa Claus throwing candy off a float at Christmas time, right? You get this image of the Pope just tossing spiritual gifts out left and right, and that's the only thing that mattered in the church. And the council really wanted to do away with it, and that's what Congar is talking about. And so in many ways, every single pope since the Vatican Council has attempted in their own way to, in a sense, empower this communio vision of the church as a communion of local churches. It's one of the reasons why John Paul II went all over the world and started World Youth Day, and then popes since him have followed suit. It's not to make the Pope a celebrity. It's to empower local churches. It's to make them realize that they are not on the fringes of the church, that everywhere that Peter is, there's the heart of the church, and I'm here. As the Pope was just in Mongolia with its 57 Catholics, right?
Yeah.
There was the church. It's a communion. And so when you politicize it, when it becomes this gigantic political party with people vying for power without real spiritual authority, that was Schindler's point. The power in the church must be welded tightly to real, legitimate spiritual and moral authority. The only kind of authority that flows out of moral and spiritual holiness. Otherwise, it just becomes a raw act of power, which then, of course, succumbs to the political impulse.
Yeah. It seems to be that equating power and authority, it's kind of law and sacrament in a certain sense, instead of seeing law as subordinate to the reality of sacrament. Authority elicits obedience, but power, it just creates compromise. So in order to kind of, you got to fall in line because you have to, because there's someone in charge. And obviously, that we should do that. But, it seems to me that complaining when things are being done in a way that isn't, the full breadth of spiritual authority, but just seems to be much more centered on political power. I understand why people are complaining, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's take the example of Pope John Paul II. He was the great ecclesiastical hero of my lifetime. I was a young seminarian. I didn't make it to priesthood, but I was a young seminarian in the year when he was elected Pope. Now, why did I have such a devotion to John Paul, and still do? It had very little to do with the fact that he wielded juridical power. It had everything to do with the fact that I was simply drawn to his holiness. He had real authority in his person, in his sanctity, in his holiness. And that's what, in a sense, then grounded the efficacy of his teaching as Pope. Now, I would segue to Pope Francis, and I kind of felt the same way about Benedict. Now we have Pope Francis, and I freely acknowledge he's the real Pope. I don't think he's a heretic, and he has legitimate power to do whatever the heck he wants to do in the church. But he doesn't have a great deal of authority to me, not in that moral and spiritual sense, because I deem him deficient in those areas. And I know that for many of your viewers might sound harsh and judgmental and wrong for a Catholic to say that, but I just hold that as an example. I'm not bragging about it. I don't use it as a point of reference. It just goes to show, for somebody else, maybe Pope Francis is a real authority. Maybe they do see in him a real vibrancy and holiness and sanctity that they're drawn to. I don't. I'm still drawn to John Paul II. So that's kind of a good example, what I'm talking about, the difference between power and authority.
Yeah. Me personally, again, it goes back to the difference between what the Holy Father is teaching us, which to me seems wonderful, and what's going on with some of the cardinals that have been empowered and some of the people appointed. Yeah. And it's like, and yet, the conservatives are being attacked, by people in the church, on the media. And yet we have Cardinal McElroy, who is promoting the changing of the teaching on homosexuality. and this person has been empowered by the structure of the church. It's very confusing and seems unfair. And yet that doesn't mean we deny anything like, the truth of ultramontanism. I know the term isn't the best maybe, but the Pope is the spiritual authority of the church. He has the jurisdiction. We can't go around consecrating bishops against his express will,
Right.
but we can say, look, we're frustrated because this is not, the Pope doesn't seem to be listening to what we're saying and appointing people that seem to be going against what he's saying.
Yeah, I mean, but let's be fair. All popes appoint some guys who are kind of clunkers as his bishops or even cardinals. Even John Paul had his lousy appointments. But I think on the preponderance, on the whole, his appointments were better than those of Pope Francis. And so, especially when you look at the American Church, I think it's very clear that Pope Francis does not really care for the American Catholic Church very much. I think he has a stereotype and a caricature in his head of the American Church. And this came out in a talk he gave to Portuguese Jesuits on his trip to Portugal recently. The interview, which was just released by the Vatican. And in that interview, one of the Portuguese Jesuits asked Pope Francis what he thought of the American Catholic Church. And he didn't hold anything back. He said the American Catholic Church is, in so many words, I'm paraphrasing now, is kind of riddled with reactionary, ideology-bound right-wingers that are standing in the way of the Holy Spirit. He once again called them backwardists and rigid and so on. He had a lot of nasty things to say about American Catholics. So then when you look at his episcopal appointments in the United States and who he's given red hats to, and you look at people like Cardinal McElroy, Cardinal Supich, Cardinal Tobin, and what you see are three very liberal prelates, very, very, very liberal guys. And it's almost as if the Pope is saying to the American Church, I don't like you guys, and so I'm going to give you cardinals that I know you don't like because I know it irritates you. And that's fine because you irritate me. And so I'm going to irritate you right back. Because you're right, Cardinal McElroy is a bit of a lightweight, to be honest with you. And there were other more worthy prelates in the United States worthy of the red hat, but he gave it to this obscure diocese, obscured by red hat categories, San Diego, which has never had a cardinal before, to Cardinal McElroy, like you said, who's openly said the church's teaching on homosexuality is incorrect and needs to change. It's called for the ordination of at least female deacons and probably of women. And so one has to sit back and wonder, what kind of a mess is Pope Francis trying to make here? And of course, when it came to the Pope selecting those who will be at the synod from the American Church, he chose who? McElroy, Supich, Tobin, and Father James Martin, another advocate of LGBTQ issues. So a picture begins to emerge of a Pope who leans progressive. I agree with you. A lot of what he writes is beautiful and great, and I don't accuse him of heresy as some do. He's not a heretic. He's a legitimate Pope.
Yeah.
But I think his prudential decisions indicate that he is a man who leans leftward theologically. And we'll just see how that plays out in the upcoming synod next month.
Yeah. Okay, so these kind of political wars in the church right now has created a huge divide, especially in the U.S. I mean, you have a bunch of people who are running to traditionalism as a safe haven, and then others who are kind of participating in the power politics and calling everybody out, saying that they're wrong to be frustrated. And then you have some people who try to be balanced, and I think Michael often does a good job. People don't like what he's doing, but I think he's trying to be fair because I've been on his end of the spectrum where people are just accusing the Pope of heresy when it's clearly not heresy. It doesn't mean that there aren't things that Pope Francis says or does that are really annoying, right? Like the appointments, for example. But this has created a divide and a split. So shouldn't we just, go back before the council and go back to, a way of doing theology that ignores the text of the council? Is that maybe the solution? You went back to the old liturgy.
Yeah, here's why. You go back before the council and you had a church that was essentially run by the Pope, like as I said, as the CEO of Catholic Inc., and the bishops were its branch managers. So you have all these rad trads running around saying, we don't like this Pope, and therefore we're going to ignore him. And you have traditionalists who are accusing, conservative Catholics of being hyper papalists, and how dare you pay so much attention to the Pope? We need to get back to before the council. Well, if you get back to before the council, then you're right back to popes as monarchs running everything. And so you're not what you're really longing for, in other words, I guess, is a time when the Pope wasn't Pope Francis. I think that's kind of what it boils down to, and that's a shame, because he is the Pope, and I don't lay awake at night worrying about the fact that Pope Francis is Pope. This too shall pass. He's not my cup of tea, but he's the Pope. Seems to have his heart in the right place for the most part, and that's what he's doing, what popes do. And but I do agree. I do think, though, and I think Mike Hanby's article points this out, I think Pope Francis has succumbed a bit to this political temptation. Some have said, well, he's a Peronist, following the politics of Juan Perón in Argentina. And what Peronists loved to do politically was to muddy the waters, to agitate the waters, to create a mess politically, into which they then interjected themselves as the only solution. And so some people say, well, the Pope is playing kind of Peronist politics with the church. That explains why he'll say great things one day and then do weird things the next. And it's all part of his attempt to sort of destabilize things. I don't know if any of that's true. And quite frankly, I get kind of tired of speculating about it all.
Yeah.
He's the Pope. He's not a heretic. He's written some beautiful things. Now we got a synod coming up. We'll see what comes of that. He's 87 years old. I think he's 87, might still be 86. And like I said, this too shall pass, and then we'll get another Pope.
Yeah, well, speaking of the synod coming up, of course, it's an advisory body. A lot of people, I think, are under the impression that it's another council and that it has authority on its own. It's just an advisory body that will advise the Pope, and the Pope will write something at the end. That being said, a lot of the people there, a lot of the working documents, a lot of what's being talked about is really about this, the inspiration of the Spirit towards a new path to do new things. And so it struck me. I was reading today Joseph Ratzinger's Introduction to Christianity. If I can burden you with another quote here, Joseph Ratzinger has this beautiful passage that really struck me concerning the synod. He says, "Faith makes a definitive claim on man and cannot be succeeded one day after the reign of the Father in childhood and that of the Son in youth by an enlightened age of the Spirit that would obey only its own reason and insinuate that it was the Holy Spirit. To be sure, faith has its terms and stages, but it is precisely in this way that it constitutes the abiding ground of man's existence, a ground that is always one and the same. This is also how it comes about that faith can have final statements, dogma, and creed, in which its intrinsic finality is articulated. Again, this does not mean that these formulas cannot open further in the course of history and thus be understood in fresh ways, just as the individual must continually learn to understand the faith afresh as a result of his own experiences in life. But it does mean that in the course of this understanding and maturing, the unity of what is understood neither can nor may be destroyed." Now, the point of me reading that is that I think Pope Francis absolutely agrees with that, but the working documents and the people there, I don't think they do. And so that's why people are concerned, because what is this supposed to do, this synod?
Yeah, I'm writing an article for our Sunday Visitor right now as we speak on the synod on this particular point. And it is worrisome. What worries me more than anything, and I want to come back to this thing about the Holy Spirit in a second, but kind of one of the things that worries me is that one of the reasons why the Second Vatican Council created turmoil in its wake, so much turmoil. I mean, I grew up in that turmoil. I experienced it firsthand, and it was real. It wasn't made up. One of the reasons is that before the council even met, there were all kinds of very liberal Catholics out there with a very complicit secular mass media ginning up all of this excitement in the church, that there are going to be all these changes and the Holy Spirit's doing a new thing and the church is going to undergo a second reformation and it's going to be a revolution in the church and we're going to get women priests and married priests and contraception and divorce and remarriage and intercommunion with Protestants and blah, 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 blah. It was just a great big laundry list of liberal wishes. Well, then when the council didn't do that, and then when Paul VI, when he implemented the council, didn't do that, the liberals who were at the council kind of rebelled anyway and said, well, they started talking about this thing called the spirit of the council. Forget the council itself. The most important thing about the council was the event itself. It was an action of the spirit setting into a process, a dynamism. We don't care about the actual documents because the council set something in motion that we now need to finish. So they then pushed forward this revolution that unfortunately took hold, and popes like John Paul and Benedict attempted to rein it in. Now, see, this is my fear about the synod. I don't think Pope Francis wants the synod to be anything crazy or wacky. In fact, he has said it's not supposed to be a parliament where we're voting on new doctrines and that sort of stuff. And yet, when you look out there in the internetosphere, and when you look at prelates like a Cardinal McElroy, for example,
or Cardinal Coleridge,
Cardinal Hollerich, these guys are all saying, well, at the upcoming synod, we need to really look into the LGBTQ issues. We need to look into the women's ordination issues and so forth. And so it's very, very clear that the progressive wing of the Catholic Church, theologically speaking, is once again ginning up expectations, telling everybody that, well, listen, this is kind of like a mini Vatican III coming up. We got our big opportunity here to open up new windows because the Holy Spirit's a moving. It's a church on the move. All right. And finally, the church is listening to us and so on. So my fear is that after the synodal process is over in 2024, and if Pope Francis, God willing, is still with us and issues an apostolic exhortation, and he doesn't give that wing of the church what it wants, what's going to happen? Because the Pope himself has empowered these people, and these are the people that are now ginning up the expectations. Now, there are all these millions of Catholics out there expecting that this synod is going to create the sort of Vatican III revolution in the church. I don't think it is. But in many ways, perhaps it's not going to matter what the synod actually concludes, because the synod has set off a process that might be unstoppable. That's the problem.
Mm-hmm. So, but some people might say, and I've heard this a lot from some of the traditionalists that tune in, that the council may not have endorsed all that list that you gave us, but it had the seeds of it, and then a progressive would step in and saying, yes, it had the seeds of it. Now we have to continue this reform. But John Paul II and Benedict were retrograde. They were retrograde. They basically got in the way and were backward looking and stopped the process. So how could we, address that? Because here the traditionalists and the progressive are actually agreeing once again on the council. And
isn't it ironic, right? And the fact is, John Paul and Benedict did not understand the Second Vatican Council. Excuse me, they were both there, and they were both very, very instrumental in that council. So to say that those two guys didn't understand the council is risible on the face of it. What they really mean is that John Paul and Benedict interpreted the council properly. They didn't interpret it as an event that started a process that we can now just do whatever we want, say whatever we want. They actually stuck to the conciliar texts, the conciliar theology, and they sought to unpack that as to the best of their ability. Now, and so the progressives are just wrong about that. Now, as far as the traditionalists go, the traditionalists are always harping. Oh, there are all these little loaded time bombs in the council. All of these ambiguities. Where is the council riddled with these ambiguities? They're always hard. Traditionalists of my acquaintance are always hard pressed to actually give concrete examples of the ambiguities that they're talking about. And when they do raise a few ambiguities, they betray the fact that their own theology is extremely narrow. So, for example, they say, well, the council kind of opened the door to the idea that non-Catholics can be saved. Yeah, it kind of did. Yeah. Right. As all the way back to the church fathers, you can find those who said that non-Catholics can be saved. And the fact that the council said so doesn't in any way change doctrine or whatever. And so what are you really saying? I mean, you see this from certain traditionalists who are now saying, well, the church is now not doing any missionary work because it It doesn't believe in hell, and it doesn't believe that most people are going to hell. I mean, I know traditionalists. I've seen their writings in Crisis Magazine. I won't name names, other places, who explicitly say that until we return to the idea that most people are going to hell, we will not evangelize properly. And I've heard, for example, I will mention one name, Dr. Ralph Martin, say non-Catholics can go to heaven, but it's very hard. It's very difficult. Now, okay, maybe that's true. Maybe it's not true. But I don't see that as an ambiguity in the council. That's not an ambiguity at all. It's the council saying, no, I don't agree with that. We think that salvation is a far more expansive category than we used to think. Okay, and you can find examples from within the tradition of the church fathers, doctors of the church, who also believed that salvation was fairly yes, the church is necessary for salvation, just as Christ is necessary for salvation. All salvation comes through Christ, through the church, to the world. But the idea that most people are going to hell and you better be a Catholic in order to avoid that, that's certainly not the council. So anyway, I'm going off on a bit of a rant and a tangent.
No, you're fine.
My point is simply this: when you start to actually have a conversation with a traditionalist and ask them, please tell me what's ambiguous, all of a sudden you begin to see that their own theology is rather horrifying. Oh, there's the other ambiguity. They allowed for religious freedom. Yeah. Dignitatis Humanae at the Second Vatican Council said that, grounded in papal teaching going back to Leo XIII, even Pius IX, rooting the religious sense in human dignity and the rights of conscience, the church has moved towards the view that all people should have the rights of religious conscience in civil society. And the traditionalists object to that because they believe in Catholic states, confessional states. They believe in the state coercing people to be Catholic, not physically coerce them. I'm not talking inquisitions, but establishing tax laws and other forms of laws that, in a sense, disenfranchise non-Catholic religions and enfranchise the Catholic religion. Now, maybe we should have that. Maybe we shouldn't. I mean, the church has had such arrangements before. But the fact of the matter is that is a very, very narrow point of view. And it's not a point of view that's going to be very popular in the modern world. Not that we have to be popular, but if you're talking about evangelization, if two of your first key points in your evangelizing are, by the way, you're probably going to hell, and in order to keep you from going to hell, I think we need to have a Catholic state that's going to coerce you into being a Catholic through various means. That's not going to go very far. And if that's your theology, you're in deep kimchi. You're in deep trouble, because that's a non-starter.
Yeah, I mean, Bishop Robert Barron is the perfect example as to why this is all a bunch of nonsense. I mean, he's the most successful evangelist in the United States, period. And he's thoroughly a man of the of the council, and loves the council and loves its theologians. And about the religious liberty thing, Dr. Schindler and Dr. Healy have this great book on human dignity and the origin of the document. And it's funny because in circles where they talk about Dignitatis Humanae, Schindler and Healy's work is never mentioned. They don't do the homework. They don't want to look into it. Because, again, like you said, there's this narrow-minded understanding of the tradition that fails to see, the vastness of it. And anyway, but one thing is that the traditionalists, and this was supposed to be more about the progressives, but the traditionalists, they talk about the council being pastoral, so we can ignore it. But really, what they mean is that no, it's doctrinal. We don't like the doctrine, which is exactly what you're saying. So which one is it?
Yeah,
anyway.
The council did put forward a very profound Christocentric theology that needs to be listened to. But unfortunately, the progressives want to move beyond Christ, and the traditionalists want to put Christ in a box. And both are deeply problematic, and they both end up marginalizing Christ in their own way.
So I think this is a perfect segue into the question, really, which is, what is Communio Theology? It's a big question, but it's an important one. And I think a lot of people are interested, just no one's talking about it except for people like you.
Well, it could mean different things depending on how your entry point of description. I'll begin with just the name Communio, and I've already mentioned it. It's rooted in the notion of communion. that the church is a communion of churches centered around the Petrine ministry. But the very communion of the church is grounded first and foremost in the intra-Trinitarian communion of persons in the divine life. So ultimately, the church is the Trinitarian life of God as it comes alive in all of these various local churches under Peter and with Peter. Okay, now that sounds rather vague and abstract, but it isn't, because what it means is that the very first fact of the church is that it is a theocentric and Christocentric reality. That is what the church is. The church is not a voluntary association of like-minded thinkers. It's not a Boy Scout jamboree. It's not a fellowship hall. Jesus doesn't coagulate on the plate out of our common love for one another. The church is a communion of believers grounded in the intra-Trinitarian communion of persons communicated to us via the Spirit in Christ. That's what the sacraments are. And so Communio theologians want to refocus our attention on the deep and profound theological reality that is the church. Now, Communio theology, therefore, arose as a counterpoint to the very moribund and narrow neo-scholastic theology that was around before the Second Vatican Council. And to repeat myself, that wanted to view the church in these very forensic and juridical and legalistic ways. Right? Where Catholicism was a kind of contractual Catholicism rather than an intentional Catholicism, which is why, by the way, the bottom fell out after the council. And so Communio theologians said, no. We need to get beyond this vision of the church as a juridical legal structure, even though it has those elements. Those elements are grounded in something deeper. Now, to that end, what the hallmark of a ressourcement or communio thinker, ressourcement simply means French word. Let's go back to the sources. Those thinkers want to place, in order to retrieve the Christological center of the church, they wanted to place greater emphasis on Scripture and the church fathers. Thomas Aquinas is a great theologian, but it was almost as if he was the only theologian in the church that anybody wanted to listen to. And so the ressourcement of communio thinkers said, yeah, Aquinas is great, and we're going to continue to use him, obviously, because he's such a tremendous resource. But there are other elements of the tradition that need to be retrieved, essentially the church fathers and a deep dive into Scripture. And so if I had to really encapsulate communio theology, it would be a retrieval of the fullness of the tradition, retrieving it from the narrowness of reducing the tradition to simply Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah, I mean, in many areas, when I read Ratzingers' works, he gives a chronology and like a theological chronology and explanation of what went wrong after the council and how it's connected to what was wrong before the council. And he does so brilliantly. And that's really why when I read him, Vatican II makes sense to me. But when I read either a traditionalist or a progressive, everything crumbles. So that's actually when I finally saw what he meant when he talked about this hermeneutic of reform in continuity. And his language of hermeneutics finally kind of made sense to me when I saw how he connected the problems before and after. Now the council is the solution, even though it's happening kind of historically, created a vacuum. And that's when everything went to crap. Yeah. But
yeah, it did.
Yeah.
I mean, let's go ahead. Well, and the council just might well be passé. In some sense, it may have missed its moment. Some councils do fail. And I'm willing to accept that. Okay. The council wanted to do this, and instead that happened. My point would be, nevertheless, the Second Vatican Council did advance a deep and profound theology. And as a theologian, I'm not so interested in whether or not people care about Vatican II. Oh, Vatican II, we have to live by Vatican II. I don't really care. What I care about are the ideas, the theological, Christological, Christocentric ideas of the council. That's what I think the church needs more of. And even had we never had a Vatican II, I would say we need more of that, please. More Romano Guardini, more Henry de Lubac, more Louis Bouillet, more Joseph Ratzinger, more those kinds of guys, and not so much the Hans Kungs and Karl Rahners and those kind of guys.
Yeah. No, I think someone once said councils are kind of like springs of water. At first, they come up in muddy water, but they become clear downstream. And hopefully that's what will happen.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, keep in mind, people, it's just 60 years after the council. And people say, well, look what the council caused. By its fruit you shall know them. Just ask St. Athanasius what he thought about the peace after the Council of Nicaea. Cost him his life. Okay. The fact that the Council of Nicaea, condemned Arianism did not end Arianism. Arianism stuck around for quite a while. There were emperors who were Arian, and Athanasius had to fight against all of that. And it took several more ecumenical councils to completely flesh out, okay, if Jesus is God, does it mean that he's not man? Oh, no, he's man. Well, then how do man and God go together? Well, you need another council for that. And so you end up at the Council of Chalcedon that sort of tries to tie it all together. But to this day, you still have non-Chalcedonian churches like the Coptics who reject the conclusions of Chalcedon and its resolution of the Christological crisis of how the divinity and the humanity go together. And my point is, I mean, even in the great patristic era and the great era of the undivided church with these great early ecumenical councils, they created so much controversy that it cost people their lives. And just even ask Maximus the Confessor, a few hundred years later, he's still fighting these battles. All right, we're a mere 60 years at the Second Vatican Council. The dust hasn't still completely settled. So let's just calm down, take a deep breath. And I agree with Pope Francis. I wish he lived by it, but he doesn't. I agree with Pope Francis. We need to hear all voices. Unfortunately, Pope Francis doesn't seem interested in hearing the traditionalist voice or even the conservative voice. So I'm very suspicious that what he means by inclusion and dialogue is kind of what they meant in 1975. We'll dialogue until we get our way, and then dialogue will end. And that's that's the modus operandi of progressive Catholics. They want to keep the door open by constantly talking about dialogue. Let's just talk. Oh, we just want to talk. And then they get into a position of authority and all talking ceases and they get their way. So my point is that in the wake of the council and all the turmoil, we do need to hear all voices. And we especially do need to hear, I've been hard on the traditionalists, but we need to hear the traditionalist voice because it's an important voice and they're in the church, right? They're people too, right? And quite frankly, instead of a synod on synods, why don't we have a synod on the liturgy? Not that I want Pope Francis running a synod on the liturgy, but you get my point. I mean, is there a more divisive thing in the church right now than the liturgy? Is there a greater need in the church right now than for some peace to come in the liturgy wars? Could we not maybe then make that front and center as an ecclesial agenda to sort of reach some kind of consensus as to what our liturgy should look like?
Speaking of your point about a dialogue that ends once someone gets their way, there's actually an anecdotal story that I heard from one of Louis Bouillet's friends who's still alive. Bouillet was in Rome, and Ratzinger was there, and they were listening to a talk that Ronner gave, Karl Ronner. And the talk went on. It was a pretty long talk, and at one point, Ratzinger leans over and whispers to Bouillet, he goes, "Another monologue on dialogue."
Yes, that is so true. I've heard that story before. Thank you for reminding me of it because that's just fantastic. It reminds me too. I once shared a limousine to the airport with Cardinal Walter Casper many years ago. Oh, it was right after John Paul had died. Well, John Paul was very sick. It was clear he was going to die. So I started talking to Walter Casper about the next pope or whatever. And then I don't know how it came up. I started talking about Hans Küng, the great liberal Swiss theologian Hans Küng. And I said to Walter Casper, I said, 60 years ago, 50 years ago, Küng wasn't a thoroughly renegade theologian, a bit liberal, but not renegade. What happened to him? Yeah. And Walter Casper simply said, well, Hans Küng became Hans Küng. And meaning that fame went to his head. And therefore, the theologian who was constantly talking about dialogue no longer really wanted to dialogue with anybody. It was his way or the highway because he was the Wunderkind who was so smart and should not disagree with whatever.
Yeah, well, so speaking of, I think that's a very good example of, the progressive attitude versus the traditionalist one. How is Communio the way forward through these dividing sides?
I think it's the way forward because it's the most traditionalist of all. See, my problem with traditionalists isn't that they're too traditional, it's that they're not nearly traditional enough. They have a tendency, not all of them, they have a tendency to sort of freeze frame what they call the tradition in the post-Tridentine era of the church. That liturgy, that expression of doctrine, that kind of scholastic theology, that kind of ecclesial life, that kind of papacy. All right. And we need to freeze frame that. And that's what Catholicism is. The trouble is that's not the deep, deep tradition. There are other deeper forms of tradition going back to the church fathers. Even Aquinas is deeper than that. All right. And not even Aquinas. Aquinas is deeper than that. And even during the era of Aquinas, there were other theologians like Bonaventure that should be listened to. In fact, Joseph Ratzinger spent more time studying Bonaventure than he did Thomas Aquinas. He did his doctorate on Bonaventure. Okay, and so there are all these magnificent mystical, monastic, spiritual, patristic, scriptural sort of resources in the tradition that traditionalists, I do not think, pay enough attention to, and the progressives don't pay attention to them at all.
Yeah.
All the progressives just care about people's zippers and what people are going to do with their zippers and whether or not they're going to feel bad or the church is going to make them feel bad about what they've done with their zippers. Okay. And it's a great diminishment of what liberal Catholicism used to be. It used to be liberal Catholics actually stood for something. Now they're just waiting for better pronouns. So it's crazy. It's insane. It's sad too, what has become. But so Communio Theology is the way forward because it's Christocentric. It's grounded in Christ. Christ's revelation to the church as that has come down to us in multifaceted ways. And so Communio is the deeper traditionalism. That's why I think it's the way forward.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of this polarization, I think Michael Hamby, again, the article he wrote was just really good. He quotes Charles Péguy, the French poet, and he says that the modern Christian is the one who does not believe what he believes. And so I think Ratzinger kind of puts his finger on this when he says that what we're dealing with here is the eclipse of God and how that's influencing the church, which is now filled with pagans in his article he wrote. And so the point really is that it's a crisis of faith. And so theology has become politics because we don't believe in God. And so we say we believe, but really we're just, worried about sociology and, promoting the next zeitgeist idea. Anyway,
and notice when that article, go ahead, Dom.
No, and I was just going to add, because Hanby puts in that same article, where are the artists, mystics, and thinkers in our suffocating and desiccated landscape?
Yes.
Such a good line. And it really encapsulates the frustration that a lot of people are feeling, I think.
Yeah, what is most needed in the church today isn't, and this once again is Communio Theology. Communio Theology is actually a theology that asks us to look at the entirety of the intellectual life of the church, not just the theological tradition, which includes the arts, which includes the life of the imagination, which is why the journal Communio, which I would ask everyone to consider subscribing to, which is an international journal started by Joseph Ratzinger, Balthasar de Lubac, and a few others, has all these international versions. The American version comes out of Washington, D.C., okay, and many times there will be articles in Communio about literature, about art, okay, and about music, because this life of the imagination is something the church used to sponsor. The church used to inspire a Dante, a Raphael, a Michelangelo, a Bernini. All right, that's what the church used to, in a sense, create in people. Now it creates a Father Rupnik, the pervert Father Rupnik, with his saints and Jesus with the black eyes, which is kind of weird when you think about it. It's probably because he's just not artistic enough to draw eyes. So he decided as a stylistic shortcut to just make all the eyes black. Kind of like, a good painter is one who will actually draw fingers. One of the hardest things for a painter to master on the human figure are hands and fingers. So anytime you see an artist that rarely shows hands in a painting, you say, well, it's because he can't draw them. So my theory is that Rupnik started drawing these black-eyed saints because he can't draw eyes. He can't paint eyes. That's my theory on Rupnik. It's probably grossly unfair, but anyway, I'm venting my spleen now. And the point is that where are the great artists of the church today? And Communio Theology would kind of like to retrieve that and resurrect that. But to go back to Ratzinger too, I mean, he wrote that article in 1958 before the council.
Mm-hmm.
It was called The New Heathenism in the Church, or New Paganism in the Church. So already in 1958, a young Father Ratzinger is saying, forget what the outward metrics might be telling you about vocations and religious orders or whatnot. The church is rotting from within. The church is riddled with de facto atheists. We have an eclipse of God in the church. And he was ringing the alarm bell already in 1958. So if the pre-conciliar church was so healthy, why did we find not just the Ratzingers of the church, but literary figures like George Bernanos in Diary of a Country Priest, or philosophers like Joseph Pieper, or Etienne Gilson, or other theologians like Dietrich von Hildebrand, Romano Guardini, ringing the alarm bell and saying there's something, or even a historian like Christopher Dawson saying there's something rotten in the church. Hey, people, pay attention. It's all going to come collapsing down at the slightest provocation if we don't do something here. And that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, and a quote directly from that article, which I'll link down below, is as follows. This has to do with a process which is going to take place either with or without the approval of the church, either sooner or later, with or contrary to the will of the church, according to the inner structural change. She will become externally a little flock. So he, yeah, as you said, he saw this right away, and as many other theologians and thinkers and artists saw the same thing. And I think we're living through it, and it's without the church's desire that it's happening, that she's becoming smaller and the pagans are basically.
Yeah, I mean, you know, he made that article in 1958 in Hochschild, which is a German journal, in the New Heathenism of the Church. Then by 1967, he's saying right there, you know, in the interview that became Faith in the Future, a little book, he says the church is going to become this, it's going to shrink. It's going to become a little flock, a remnant. And Ratzinger wasn't saying, I want it to be so. He was saying it's going to be so, because the Constantinian church of political arrangements is dead. And all that's going to remain isn't the political church. All that's going to remain is the church of people who believe in Jesus the Lord, in Jesus the Christ. Notice that one of the most important things of his papacy, even though it wasn't a papal act, was that 3-volume thing he wrote, you know, by the theological meditation on Jesus of Nazareth. It might be his greatest legacy ever. Okay, to say this is what we need to focus on, people. Jesus the Christ. That is the church. That should be our focus, not all this political stuff. Yeah,
amen. And shifting gears just slightly, because you brought up the rigid legal neo-scholasticism. I want to kind of open up this conversation about Thomists today, and certain Thomists back then that also saw the problem with that kind of scholasticism.
Oh yeah, big time.
Yeah, so here's the thing. I didn't grow up back then, but I was exposed to the writings of people back then, to the manuals, and it's not a caricature. There were horrendous manuals. There was a huge, especially moral manuals, and it was a reality. But Thomists, not all of them, you know, were lock and step with this kind of way of doing theology.
Oh,
I think. Go ahead.
No, it's very important to point out that there's no such thing as Thomism. There are Thomisms in the plural. The great theologian Australian Tracy Rowland, who won the Ratzinger Prize, in her book Catholic Theology, identifies no fewer than 17 different versions of Thomism in just the 20th century. So, you know, I think Resource Mount theology, Communio Theology, is a kind of Thomism. But let's stick with Thomists more who would be clearly identified as Thomists. You find guys like Etienne Gilson, Jacques Maritain, Joseph Pieper, Norris Clark, and a host of other Thomistic philosophers that were not Garrigou-Lagrange type neo-scholastic manualist sorts of things. And they also were very aware of the shortcomings of the politicized church. I mean, you found someone, for example, like Henry de Lubac, French Jesuit, who was fighting in the resistance against the Nazis during World War II. Well, Garrigou-Lagrange was down goose-stepping with Marshal Pétain in Vichy, France, celebrating French collaboration with the Nazis because he believed that it would lead to a restoration of the French monarchy. He believed that it would lead to a restoration of a hard Catholic integralism. Now, Lagrange had a lot of good things going for him. But the point is that traditionalists point to him and say, we need to go back to Lagrangian Thomism. Why? Why should we go back to Lagrangian Thomism? It's a dead end. It's a complete dead end. He said some good things, but philosophers like Thomistic philosophers like Etienne Gilson and Joseph Pieper were far more profound than Garrigou Lagrange. And I know I'm being harsh with regard to Garrigou right now, and I wouldn't be, except that he's constantly thrown up in my face as somebody that we need to return to. We need to return to. Well, all right, fine. If that floats your boat, that's fine. But there's other kinds of Thomism, and I'm so glad, Dom, that you pointed this out, because there were Thomists who were also ringing the alarm bell about the juridical, forensic, contractual Catholicism of that time.
Yeah, well, so there was an exchange of articles recently between you and Dr. Meinert, and Richard Decloux also joined the fray, and I'll make sure to list those in the bottom. But there are some Thomists who want to retrieve Father Lagrange, but not in a way that ignores history, but that complements certain things. So there's a dialogue going on, and so really this kind of leads to the question: how can Communio make common cause with certain Thomists, or can it? Because
well, it can.
Yeah, so I'll just leave it at that.
And I have made common cause with Dr. Meinert, who I think is doing great work. And I want to be clear that I'm not thinking of him or insinuating him in my remarks about those who want to resurrect Lagrange. Dr. Meinert is well aware of Lagrange's shortcomings. He has a great sympathy with elements of Lagrangian Thomism, but he also is aware of his shortcomings. And Meinert's point is kind of your point, that there are many, many, many Thomists of the middle part of the 20th century who are saying very similar things to the Communio thinkers that just get ignored because they're being dismissed as those neo-scholastic sort of thinkers. And I think Dr. Meinert is entirely correct to point out that given the polemics of those times, the 20s, 30s, and even into the 50s, it was hard for Communio thinkers and those Thomists to get along because they were very acrimonious. And part of it was the nasty atmosphere created by the Holy Office, dragging people in for silencings and so on. But the fact of the matter is, now is the time to set those kinds of polemics aside. And Dr. Meinert is correct. Dr. Decloux is correct. So what my remarks are aimed more at the kind of traditionalist who's actually never read Garrigou Lagrange. But Lagrange is just a kind of cipher or a totem in their mind for a kind of preconciliar theology that was sound and grounded in truth and not modernist. And so that's the kind of thing we need to get back to. That's the kind of traditionalist I'm talking about here. A very ideologically driven traditionalist who probably has never read Aquinas and never read Lagrange. But for them, they're just sort of symbols of something.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Okay, so let's see if I can tie all this up. Here's my final question for you, Dr. Chapp. And it is as follows. Who can people turn to today in theology to use as a guide, and why is it Pope Benedict?
And why is what?
Why is it Pope Benedict?
Well, I would turn people to the encyclicals of John Paul II and Pope Benedict. So I would include both of those pillars of modern Catholic thinking. But beyond their encyclicals as Pope, I would direct people to the scholarly theological works of Joseph Ratzinger. I think Introduction to Christianity, the book you've quoted from tonight, is a great place to start. There are also some ressourcement books by someone like De Lubac or Guardini that I think are still pertinent today. So De Lubac's seminal book from the 1930s, 100 years ago, right, 90 years ago, it's simply called Catholicism, is a great watershed book that can be read to great profit. I also think there's a great neglected thinker from that era as well into is Dietrich von Hildebrand, who I think is a tremendous bridge thinker. He bridges Thomistic thought and phenomenology and more Augustinian forms of thinking. He was simply a brilliant, brilliant thinker. And I would encourage people to read more Dietrich von Hildebrand. I really do. I'm kind of on a von Hildebrand kick myself lately. So Ratzinger, von Hildebrand, de Lubac. I would throw Hans Urs von Balthasar in there. And I mean that. I mean, that's who I did my dissertation on. But he's difficult for a beginner to this kind of thinking. Balthasar is a guy, it's better to start with his shorter works, like a short primer for unsettled laymen or convergences, or don't try and get one of his heavier tomes. But I also am hesitant to recommend Balthasar simply because it goes to, and so then you're in trouble if you say, yeah, I'm reading Balthasar right now. But if you can find some of Balthasar's shorter works, that's certainly great. But there's some contemporary thinkers too. If you've got the intellectual chops for it, Cyril O'Regan, you can't do worse than Cyril O'Regan. He's fantastic. And there's some really promising young theologians out there. Keith Lemna, Jonathan Cerullo, Matthew Ramage. There's some really young guys doing some great stuff out there right now.
Wonderful. Thanks, Dr. Chapp. Okay, so is there any place you want to direct the audience to for more of your work? So any articles you've written or videos you've made?
Well, I write a lot for the National Catholic Register and for Catholic World Report. And I do a lot of podcast videos, but everything can be, and I do blog posts as well. So everything can be found on my blog, which is called GaudiumEtSpes22.com. And there's 3 years worth of interviews and blog posts and journal articles that for people to catch up on. It's all there.
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Chapp. Well, I think that'll do it for today. Thanks for coming on the show, Dr. Chapp. I really appreciate it. This is the third time I've had you on. We're making it a yearly tradition, it looks like.
I love it.
Thanks again.
Thanks, Tom.
Audience, if you enjoyed this content, please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, leave a comment down below. You can support us at patreon.com/thelogosproject. And I too have articles at theecclesiablog.com. And without further ado, we'll see you guys all next time. Thank you.